truth of it, as he has the pretense to it. What follows is that on the plane of history, but here we take part from Maritain's interest in theology, for histories is the only plane we are concerned with. So on the plane of history, the sovereign is not sovereign. Of course, this became apparent during the French Revolution, but it was also recently shown during the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, when Ben Ali and Mubarak were forced to step down, the former fleeing the country, the latter being now under arrest. The void and falseness within the concept and reality of sovereignty is what the 99% movement that started with Occupy Wall Street is also finally exposing. Why are Maritain's analysis and critical sovereignty important? Why? That is, despite some evident limitations, because then Maritain reinscribes the idea of a supreme power and he ascribes that to the state. In any case, they are important for us because they show that the secularization of theological concepts, first among them the concept of sovereignty, a practice which has had a long tradition in political theory, Carl Schmitt being one of the most notable names within it, is simply wrong. This should be the case not only for those who think in a thoroughly earthly, secular way, like myself, but even for the believers, who may still entertain the notion that among his attributes, God also has a genuine sovereignty. To say that it is wrong is to say that it is both a logical and metaphysical error and a historical, political, and ethical abuse. And here I would like to remind you of what I noted above about the word abuse, in which the prefix ab points to the distance and separation which is also typical of sovereignty itself. In other words, sovereignty is always abusive. As Giorgio Agamben says in a book called Profanations, I'm quoting, secularization is a form of repression, end quote. And he continues, quoting again, the political secularization of theological concepts, the transcendence of God as a paradigm of a sovereign power, does nothing but displace the heavenly monarchy onto an earthly monarchy, leaving its power intact, end quote. The sovereign retains the signs and attributes of the Father as the fully independent, autonomous, and separate head of the family, the community, the state, the cosmos. But the fully independent individual, just like the sovereign, is a myth and a fiction. I think of the pathetic way in which Hosni Mubarak, a few days before he gave up power, appeared on TV in front of the Egyptian people, trying to persuade them to listen to him, namely to the person who had treated them as a father all along. Not differently, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, certainly not a member of New York City's 99%, tells the Occupy Wall Street protesters that the political financial system they want to bring down is in fact what sustains them and the city. Of course, no one believes these stories anymore. In the age of information and the fluid production of knowledge, the age in which everybody is not only a filmmaker, as Michael Moore recently said, but also a philosopher, a political theorist, an activist, and so on, the age in which everybody is a leader, as the Occupy Wall Street movement knows, and demonstrates, there is no place for the head of the sovereign separate from the body. The head is now part of the body. It is the body itself. The separate head falls to the ground. It falls into the abyss that itself has created. The critique of sovereignty as domination raises the question of freedom. This is particularly interesting because the idea of sovereignty is often associated with the ideas of autonomy, independence, and thus freedom. Furthermore, both sovereignty and freedom are rooted in power. Let's first deal with this latter point. How do sovereignty and freedom diverge from one another, being rooted in the same, in power? For Hobbes, for instance, originally, in the so-called and really fictitious state of nature, which is a state of anarchy, chaos, insecurity, and war, the freedom that we have to do something, to do as we please, is equal to the power that we had to do something, to do as we please. And that is our rights. Our freedoms and rights are limited only by our material, mental, and physical powers. It is precisely because of the state of insecurity and violence we otherwise find ourselves in that in Hobbes' account, just as in Baudin's accounts, we give up our rights, freedoms, and powers and transfer them to the sovereign, to the law. We do that for our own sake, for the sake of our own security. But it is evident that what the sovereign gets from us is precisely the power to do as we please. The right we have, I'm quoting from Hobbes, to everything. The right we had to everything, even to one another's body. End quote. And this is obviously a raw power, whose real substance is violence. What follows logically and phenomenologically is that the law now established by the sovereign, really the law which is identical with the sovereign, I am the state, says Louis XIV, right? L'État c'est moi, is nothing but that very power as violence institutionalized. Individual freedoms become the one freedom of the sovereign to do as he pleases. They become the one freedom of the state to do as it pleases. We don't need to look too far for clear examples of this. When someone is executed, even though there exist serious doubts as to whether they are guilty of any crime, as it was the very sad and tragic case of Troy Anthony Davis in Georgia last month, we have a display of this type of institutional power as violence, which is also the freedom of the state to do as it pleases. The drone attacks in Pakistan, Yemen, and other countries, as well as the power that President Obama has ascribed to himself to kill American citizens deemed to be a threat to national security, are other notable examples of the freedom to do as one pleases, and that is to say, of power as violence institutionalized. Finally, when the police abuse and arrest peaceful demonstrators, as it has been routinely the case in New York since the Occupy Wall Street movement started, and certainly even more so a few nights ago in Oakland, or when the police abuse and arrest regular people under the stop and frisk law, We had the same power as violence institutionalized, turning the city into a prison camp. And in the case of Auckland, a few nights ago, that means, turning the city into a war zone. Probably everybody saw. I hope it is clear that this type of freedom is very individualistic, lacking ethical grounding, and it is truly poor freedom. In fact, true freedom, the freedom that is a complication of the human condition and must be used with extreme care, is based on a universal and common concept of justice. Leibniz, that's the name that I'm using now. Leibniz, a 17th century philosopher and an early critic of the concept of sovereignty, in a wonderful short essay called Meditation on the Common Concept of Justice, highlights precisely the commonality and universality of this concept. For Leibniz, I'm quoting, to say stat pro ratione voluntas, which is Latin, to say my will takes the place of reason, is properly the motto of tyrants, end quotes. The will is not free to make an action just or unjust. Rather, the will is only free to choose between doing and not doing a just action, as well as doing and not doing an unjust action. As Leibniz says, quoting again, it is one thing to be just, and another to pass for it, and to take the place of justice. End quote. For Leibniz, the problem does not reside within the will, but within the understanding, one might say education. For the confusion as to what makes an action just or unjust has to do with, I'm quoting, the failure to distinguish between rights and facts, end quote. Thus, quoting again, to say that just is whatever pleases the most powerful is nothing else than saying that there is no certain and determined justice, which keeps one from doing whatever he wants to do and can do with impunity, however evil he may be, end quote. For Leibniz, quoting again, the error of those who have made justice dependent on power comes in part from confounding right and law, end quote. And he explains, quoting again, right cannot be unjust, it is a contradiction, but law can be, end quote. For us, the importance of Leibniz philosophy within the context of a discourse on freedom and sovereignty, moving from positions that are certainly different from Leibniz's own, lies in the awareness that radical social change requires that fundamental categories we live by be rethought, and some of them, such as sovereignty, eliminated. Leibniz is one of the philosophers showing the way. He calls into question the accepted notion of the law as command, typical and widespread in his days as well as in ours. He does not get rid of the political concept of sovereignty, but limits it to situations of internal and territorial control. Thus, with Leibniz, sovereignty becomes a relative concept when applied to the political sphere, and full sovereignty only obtains in the sphere of theology. But there too, it does not have a decisionist character, rather it has a rational power, rational one, and of a type of reason based on benevolence and love. In other words, it is not based on the will, certainly not solely on the will, but it is based on reason and on a rational will. For Carl Schmitt, who follows Hobbes, the concept of sovereignty, as used in political philosophy and in juridical theory, is precisely the secularization of a theological concept. But for Carl Schmitt, this is okay, this is precisely what it should be. But this is again not, this is a decisionist theology for Carl Schmitt rather than a rational one. Decision is really the key concept for Schmitt. Sovereignty indeed is decision and domination. It is not simply a technical concept in state theory and international relations, but it is rather the personal privilege of the ruler. I'm quoting from Schmitt. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. This is how Carl Schmitt's political theology famously starts. But what is it precisely to decide on the exception? In a sense, the answer is contained in the paradoxical figure of the sovereign, in sovereignty as, I'm using Schmitt's word, a borderline concept, one pertaining to the outermost sphere, end quote. Schmitt says that although the sovereign, quoting again, stands outside the normally valid legal system, he nevertheless belongs to it, end quote. He belongs to it precisely in virtue of his capacity to decide on the exception. But what precisely enables the sovereign to decide on the exception and thus be sovereign? The answer is not found in Schmitt, but in Walter Benjamin. And the answer is violence. The violence, always, I'm quoting from Benjamin, implicated in the problematic nature of the law itself, end quote, which is to say, the law is violence. In fact, the exception itself, the state of emergency, can be a mere fabrication of the sovereign, sustained by mere and raw power and by violence. It is not the exception that calls forth the sovereign decision, but the other way around. The sovereign decision creates the exception. Thus, it is not the case that the sovereign realizes that there is an objective state of need and therefore he acts decisively. Instead, the sovereign chooses which state or situation is to be raised to the level of the exception or simply fabricates it. An illustration of this would be the war on terror. One would think that there are many other more urgent situations in the world that require attention and perhaps intervention. For instance, poverty, child labor, inadequate education. Yet none of these are raised to the status of the exception. And the reason for this neglect must be sought precisely in the fact that they are not contained in the concept of the person of the sovereign. In other words, they are not part of the sovereign's interests and concerns. They are other than the sovereign. In fact, from the sovereign's point of view, they are instances of bare life. And that is to say, life that has lost all forms of protections and security. Life that might as well waste and rot. Here we can think again of the unsustainable, uneven relation at the global level between the 1% sovereign power and the 99% actual or potential instances of bare life. This is what, this is what the Occupy Wall Street movement, really a global movement now, has seriously and powerfully started to challenge. The sovereign decision defends itself, its autonomy and separation from the totality of life on the basis of the need for security, the logic of security. But in truth, what soon becomes an obsession with security measures, which often is simply an iron technicality, throws the vast majority of beings, the 99%, in conditions of dire and growing insecurity. And this happens in many ways and at all levels of everyday life: economic insecurity, ecological disasters, the thwarting of political, social, and personal freedoms, the imposition on the city of the generalized model of the prison. As Professor Watson says in the article I mentioned above, I'm quoting, "State security masks violence and domination, and provides the necessary cover for the rule of necessity, economic domination, and political coercion, subordinates human security to the state's security, and covers exploitation and capital accumulation in the tracks of security." End quote. Furthermore, there is today a general conscription, as an author recently wrote. But differently from this author's view, according to which this conscription can be understood as the condition of security and freedom, I see it as the condition of insecurity and unfreedom. In other words, we are called upon the defense of a false sense of security, which is the cause of unimaginable tragedies for many. The warning that since 9/11 we see everywhere, in New York City at least, "If you see something, say something," is an interesting, important illustration of this. See something like what? Philosophically, epistemologically, we know that if we see something, we must first of all make sure that what we see is actually the case. Otherwise, we can mistake a wallet for a gun, an innocent conversation for a conspiracy, a long beard or a dark complexion for the certain sign and intention of evil. And all these things have actually happened. The state of exception, as Giorgio Agamben has said, is the camp, thus also the prison, turned into the contemporary model of the political. The paradox of sovereignty is the paradox of the state of exception become permanent. I repeat, the paradox of sovereignty is the paradox of the state of exception become permanent. The exit from this is, for Agamben, a redefinition or a recuperation of politics. And that is, I'm using Agamben's words, a space for human action without regard to the law as command. Agamben says, I'm quoting, "Politics has suffered a lasting eclipse because it has been contaminated by law, seeing itself at best as constituent power, and that is violence that makes the law, when it is not reduced to merely the power to negotiate with the law. The only truly political action, however, is that which severs the nexus between violence and law." End quote. This is the task of the global revolution that started in Tunisia with the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in December 2010 and received new impetus from the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's the task of freedom The making again of a space for human action, as Agamben says, the making of a real exception. In his eighth thesis on the philosophy of history, Walter Benjamin says, I'm quoting, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency. End quote. I'm about to finish. This real state of emergency, this real